Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair, and welcome back to the Fudgetrospective. Last week, Judy Blume injected excitement by moving the Hatchers to Princeton, like Blume herself had done in real life with her family. Mirroring reality again, Blume came up with the idea for Fudge-a-Mania when her and her husband rented a house in southwest Maine one summer in 1989, and when she arrived, she had the idea for another Sheila Tubman book, as they had just made a TV movie adaptation and it was on her mind, before it evolved into a reunion, bringing in all the main players of both parts of the series. She also states on her website that it was intended to be the final book. She'd bring them all together and then be done with it forever. Well, we know it didn't quite work out like that, but after next week, I'm sure you'll realize that it was probably all for the best. The title actually has a fun bit of history. Her husband came up with the title, but intended on it being Fudge-a-Mania, as in Maine the state, but along the way it was shortened to Mania, M-A-N-I-A. Neat bit of trivia there. Personally, I don't have quite as much of an attachment to this book as I do the others. I remember it vividly and fondly for sure, but I liked reading about their adventures in school and in New York, so while I did read this one as a kid, I didn't read it nearly as much as I did the others. Anyway, I don't think we need a complicated prologue for this one. It's Fudge, Peter, and Sheila and their families going on vacation in Maine, and the shenanigans that they get into. This is Fudge-a-Mania. The cover is great, no surprises there. Same deal as the last two with the title and author up top. We've got Fudge in the background doing a cartwheel while Uncle Feather darts out of his cage, which is about to topple over. In the foreground, Peter is leaning on a baseball bat, and again looks exasperated. I love how that's the pattern for these covers. If Peter's on it, he looks exasperated. I know that those lines are probably supposed to just be showing motion, like how he's sort of rolling his eyes, but I always saw them as bags because of how exhausting living with Fudge is. Though one thing I neglected to mention in the other ones, mainly because I had actually missed them, only seeing the words for some reason, is that the Judy Blume part always has a small object or thing relating to the story. In the first one, it was a turtle, obviously representing Dribble. In the second one, it was Uncle Feather, and in this one, it's a baseball, relating to Peter's outfit here, and to a later point in the story. Let's get to the book itself. Our third story starts out with an announcement. Ooh, deja vu. Anyway, the announcement is that Fudge has decided to get married, and Peter is shocked when he hears who the lucky bride-to-be is. Sheila Tubman. Peter is shocked that he would even consider that as an idea, but speaking of the Tubmans, the Hatchers are due to take a vacation in Maine soon and will be staying on the same property as the Tubmans, since it was Sheila's dad who gave them the idea. They'll be joined by Grandma Muriel, and Peter is allowed to bring one friend, which obviously is going to be Jimmy Fargo. Fudge can't bring any because of limited space and, well, we've met his friends in the last two books. Spending a summer with any of them is not a great prospect. The family setup is the same, but everyone's settled into having the new baby, and Fudge isn't nearly as immature as he used to be, though he's still a pain in the ass. The Hatchers make the long drive up to Maine, and when they arrive, Peter is disgusted to find out that they're not just on the same property as the Tubmans, they're in the same house. It's one of those double houses with a shared living room and kitchen, but other than that, two separate living spaces. To make matters worse, Sheila seems to have been cured of her cynophobia because the Tubmans now have a dog, though she still hates Turtle because of his smell. Peter maintains that Turtle isn't smelly until Turtle comes back from relieving himself in the woods, smelling like death, having been sprayed by a skunk. And this is why I hate leaving the city. You ever been sprayed by a skunk on West 34th Street? No siree. Though you could be accosted by a cosplayer in October. The town they're staying near, Southwest Harbor, is an extremely small town, with an ice cream shop, a bookstore, a library, and a bike shop being among the chief sights, so a far cry from New York. Imagine like Beach City from Steven Universe. After everything's calmed down, they figure out the sleeping arrangements. Peter and Fudge are sharing a room until Jimmy Fargo shows up, Tootsie sleeps with Muriel, and naturally Anne and Warren sleep together. Fudge also makes his intentions known to Buzzy Sr., Sheila's grandfather, that he plans on marrying his granddaughter, and Fudge reveals why he wants to get married, because you never have to sleep alone and be afraid of monsters. Sometimes he gets it. Not a lot of the time, but sometimes. One morning they're completely fogged in, because Maine, and Sheila opens up a bunch of windows to dissipate the house's smell. Only thing is, the Hatchers brought Uncle Feather with them, and Fudge let him out of his cage for a little while, and now that all the windows are open and Uncle Feather isn't where Fudge left him, he could be anywhere. Peter and Fudge go outside the house and check the perimeter, but in the fog, it's easier said than done. They go to one of the other houses in the area to ask if they've seen Uncle Feather, but Fudge neglects to mention that Uncle Feather is a bird, so the woman, Mrs. A, thinks that they're looking for their actual uncle, who is entirely black with yellow feet and a yellow nose. You'd think she'd question that, but a few towns over there's an army doctor who runs a fish market/hospital who recently got visited by Air Force One, so it's not the strangest thing she's ever heard of. They return disappointed, having not found Uncle Feather, and they find Sheila's older sister Libby running in fear of a bat. They rush in and find that it's not a bat, it's Uncle Feather, who never left the damn house, and they quickly put him back in his cage. Sheila asks to babysit Fudge while they're up there, since it has been a rather long time since that incident at the park, and Anne agrees, figuring that it will give Peter a break from having to play interference, though he still tags along with Fudge anyway because without Jimmy Fargo up there yet, he's sort of bored, especially since Muriel and Buzzy Sr. have hit it off and are hanging out together. A lot. Plus, Sheila needs an interpreter to understand Fudge speak. They go back to visit Mrs. A, whose granddaughter Mitzi is visiting, and is around Fudge's age. She tells Peter, Fudge, and Sheila about her grandfather's weekly town-wide softball game, and Peter is floored when he finds out who exactly her grandfather is. Big Apfel, a retired Red Sox center fielder, fictional, that despite Peter being a New Yorker and so should either be a diehard Yankees or Mets fan, is a huge fan of and is excited to get the chance to meet and play with, though neither Sheila or Fudge are impressed by that. Fudge and Mitzi hit it off, though. Peter also calls Jimmy to tell him about the game, and despite him not knowing who Big is, agrees to bring his baseball stuff, though Peter is worried about his impending arrival, since he assured Jimmy that Sheila would be far away from their house before he left. The next morning, Fudge and Sheila plant a rock garden, and Mitzi makes some mud pies, mortifying Sheila when she starts eating the mud pies, and then her and Fudge claim that they've come down with Fudge-a-Mania,
He said it! He said it!
and start spinning around, and even Peter gets in on the whole thing, though Sheila and Libby are not too amused at the chaos. Peter and Sheila get into a little argument, and Peter lashes out at Tootsie when she wants to go up, and he's admonished by their parents, leading to him momentarily missing the days when he was the only kid around. The next day, Mitzi shows Fudge a book called Tell Me a Mitzi, which is purportedly about her and her younger brother, which, according to my research that I totally didn't realize as a kid, is the name of a real-world children's book by Lair Siegel, which means that they exist in a shared universe. And people think the MCU did it first. Fudge wants to find a book about him, and he and Peter go to the library, where Fudge asks the library assistant to look it up in the catalog. Said assistant is a teenage girl named Isabel that Peter immediately falls in love with, though he can't talk to her long because Fudge has a tantrum upon finding out that Tell Me a Fudge doesn't exist, although Izzy does recommend that Fudge write the book himself, which he plans to do. That night, Peter attempts to will himself to dream about Isabel, but only manages to dream about Sheila Tubman. Well, dreams don't really mean anything, right? Right? Jimmy Fargo arrives with his dad, who was planning on camping during the trip, but because of the weather, they're forced to make room inside the house for him, which is awkward for everyone, especially Jimmy, since he can read a room. During breakfast the next day, Fudge gives a report on everyone's activities for Jimmy, including telling everyone about how Peter acted around Izzy at the library, which both Sheila and Jimmy razz him for, which Peter confronts Jimmy on how he's being nice to Sheila, and Jimmy says it's because Sheila's friend that she invited got sick and couldn't make it, and so he wanted to be nice to her. They take a bike ride into town to check out the library and show Jimmy what Izzy looks like, since he's curious. On the way, Peter swallows a fly, and they bring him to the bike shop to ask the owner, Bicycle Bob, what to do. He welcomes Peter into the ISAF, or I Swallowed a Fly Club, and prescribes a vanilla cone from the ice cream store. Though if Peter's really worried, he can ask Ann and Warren to drive him out to Crabapple Cove, because I bet Dr. Pierce's practice has an opening later that day. While they're up there, Mr. Fargo plans on doing some painting and sets up his supplies outside, though chaos quickly erupts when Fudge gets into the blueberries that Peter and Jimmy picked, so that Muriel could make a pie out of them, and eats enough to get himself sick. He also fed some to Turtle, but blueberries aren't hazardous for dogs, so he'll be fine. Fudge, not so much. Warren rents a small boat and says that whoever wants to go out with him can join. Peter and Jimmy want to go, as does Muriel, though Buzzy Sr. declines the offer. And Mr. and Mrs. Tubman and Sheila join as well, and Anne stays behind to take care of Fudge and Tootsie. They go out on the water, anchor for a bit in the open water to eat lunch, and then they start to head back. Jimmy, whose lunch consisted of a sardine and onion sandwich, gets a little seasick, and while they try to relax his stomach, the boat hits some rough waters and a gust of wind, which Warren isn't prepared for, and he snaps at everyone when they try to help. Eventually, Muriel relieves Warren of command and takes the ship safely to port, though Warren jumps the gun when leaping off the boat onto the dock to tie the ship, and ends up landing in the water. When he's fished out, he's not only pissed off, but also cold and wet. They return to the house, and when Warren goes to take a warm bath, Peter notices that Tootsie's feet are blue, but no one picked any more blueberries, and when they investigate, they find that Tootsie had stepped on Mr. Fargo's paint and walked across the canvas he had lying on the grass. At first he seems angry, and Anne and Peter worry about him exploding, but instead he picks up Tootsie and laughs, having gotten a brilliant idea for a series of paintings named Baby Feet. During dinner, Warren apologizes to his crew for how he acted on the boat, Mr. Fargo gives a toast to Tootsie, and Buzzy Sr. gives a toast to Muriel for saving the day, before kissing her, which doesn't surprise Peter, Fudge, or Sheila, but it does surprise Warren, Anne, and Mr. and Mrs. Tubman. The next day is the big softball game, and Peter drags Jimmy to the game, despite Jimmy's lack of interest because he's not confident in his baseball abilities. The team captains are picked by drawing straws, and they end up being Izzy and Fudge. Jimmy also gets Peter to admit that he likes Izzy when he remarks that Izzy is ugly, and Peter immediately jumps to refute that. During the game, nothing goes Peter's way. Fudge picks him for his team, despite him really wanting to be on Izzy's team, and Izzy ends up picking Jimmy, so him and Jimmy aren't even on the same team. Then, during the game, Peter is nervous around Big Apfel, and he makes a few errors, along with being unsatisfied that Big bats for both teams out of fairness, because it's just a fun neighborhood game and he's a major leaguer. If he was on one team instead of the other, it would stack the deck against the other team. Despite that, Fudge's team loses, but he's not mad about it, and everyone had fun, except for Peter. But between Jimmy being happy that he got pointers from Big that helped his confidence, and Fudge just having fun, which they thank Peter for, Peter ends the day happy and excited for the next game. That night, Mr. Fargo announces that his dealer loves the Baby Feet idea, so he's got a new series to work on that might be a hit and get him an art show in Soho, which Jimmy hopes will translate to his dad becoming rich and famous. And that's not the only wonderful news. Buzzy Sr. has a huge announcement. He is proposing to Muriel, and they plan to get married as soon as they can. Anne and Mr. Tubman, the children of the happy couple, are shocked and think it's too sudden, but since they're getting up there in age, they don't have time to spend years getting to know each other, and they don't have to. They're not the only ones mortified, though. Peter and Sheila are not happy with the prospect of being step-cousins. Muriel and Buzzy Sr. invite everyone in town to the wedding, and the gifts are properly themed to the person, like Big and Mrs. A bringing them an autographed baseball, bike helmets from Bicycle Bob, a book about surviving marriage from Isabel, a painting from Mr. Fargo, Fudge's only copy of Tell Me a Fudge, etc. During the wedding, Fudge, the ring bearer, spins around and loses the rings in the grass, halting the ceremony momentarily. They find him, though unfortunately they interrupt the wedding next door when they do.
I have the ring.
I have the ring! I have the ring!
In the end, the wedding goes fine from there, although it tires everyone except Fudge and Mitzi out, and the novel ends on Sheila Tubman telling Peter that even if they are related, she still promises that she'll always hate him. Peter wholeheartedly agrees, and they shake on it. Fudge-a-Mania is a really good book. I don't love it nearly as much as I do the other three for personal reasons of how much I love the other three, but it's far from being a bad book, and it holds up amazingly well. The characters are great, the world is diverse, and like the other two we've covered so far, it manages to not retread onto anything, but instead builds upon what came before, instead of relying on the novelty of referencing it. A lot of authors who do series can't seem to figure that out. We don't just have Fudge saying that he swallowed a turtle and recapping that for the reader to say, oh yeah, that happened. We get Peter swallowing a fly, and then Fudge brags that he swallowed a more impressive animal. What I really like is, because Sheila was a full-fledged character now, she gets a lot more development, even within Peter's narration. We also get more development on Jimmy Fargo's dad, which I like. An interesting thing to note is that while it's not exactly Maine, when I was a kid, there were a few summers where we went away for a few days to Cape Cod, near Provincetown, which, to my recollection, we haven't been there in a while, is very similar to the town that the Hatchers and the Tubmans stayed in, though not quite as small, but still a far cry from where I'm from. So when I was a kid, I had a visualization from my own experiences, especially with the fog and the boating. Though it wasn't as small a boat as Warren got, it was going out on one of those touristy whale-watching boats, but this just reinforces the fact that I totally resonated with these books as a kid because they seem to constantly mirror my own experiences and remind me of great times I've had with my own family. It's also just as timeless, especially since this book was released in the early 90s, and my experience as a kid in the early 2000s is identical. And it's especially timeless because they also neglect to mention what year it is on the wedding's banner, because it, and I quote, was better that way. Nice one, Judy Blume. Nice one. The book is just as funny, just as sharp-witted, and I regret that I didn't read it nearly as much as I did the others, because it is just as good. Though, thinking about it, I think I kept losing my copy in the enormous book collection I had as a kid, so that might be why I didn't read it as much, because I couldn't find it when I wanted to. And the pacing is brilliant. It's not just because it's designed for younger readers that I was able to knock out reading this entire book in a matter of hours. It's also because of how smoothly the vignettes transition into one another that you can't bear to put the book down, because even when you've read the book 15 times, you can't wait to find out what happens next. Overall, I highly recommend this book. My only complaint is that Peter seems to idolize the Red Sox player, despite the bitter rivalry between New York and Boston. But then again, what the hell do I know about sports? But does the series end on a high note, or like many authors, does it overstay its welcome? I'm sure you can figure out what it's going to be, but come back next week anyway when we finish off the series with Double Fudge. See you next time. is a huge fan of, and is excited to get the chance to meet and play with, though neither Shudge or Fila